Okay, good morning, everybody. This class and all of today's SCA and Tanach study day of learning are sponsored in memory of Mr. Stanley Chera A. My topic this morning is Israel's Declaration of Independence, the David Ben Gurion's tie, and other interesting facts about the Declaration of Israel's Declaration of Independence. It's important to note that Ben Gurion grew up religious, at least till he was around the bar mitzvah. His family was Shomer Shabbat, although a Zionist family, a learned family of sorts. But he put on tefillin at his bar mitzvah, and he certainly grew up Shomer Shabbat, and therefore religion and was something that he was familiar with, which we'll see in a moment, plays a role. However, he becomes a socialist in terms of the avodah. In fact, in his early middle age years, he's actually a big fan of Lenin. And I don't mean John Lennon of the Beatles, but Lenin of communist Russia, of later the Soviet Union. In fact, Shimon Peres in his biography writes the first time he was in a car with Ben Gurion, he was 26, 27 years old. They were traveling from Tel Aviv to Haifa, and Peres writes that I finally got a car ride with the leader, and Ben Gurion slept most of the way. He wakes up approximately 15, 20 minutes before they reach Haifa, and jumping out of his sleep, he turns to Peres and says, you know what the difference between Lenin and Trotsky was? That Lenin knew how to make a decision. Trotsky didn't. He was too much of an intellectual. So you see that Ben Gurion certainly had leanings towards communism in his earlier years. He valued the socialist ethic. He dressed very simply. He lived very simply. In fact, the only thing that he really spent money on were his books. And that was his whole gestalt. That was his whole approach to life. But if you take a look at the famous videos of him getting out of his car and then actually declaring the state, there he is in a suit and a tie. And what's going on here? Now, if you actually take a look, if you can see here, I don't know how clear it is, but this is a copy of the invitation that was sent out to people about the declaration of the State of Israel. If you see on the bottom, it says, Tilboshet Bigdei Beged Kahim, Bigdei Chag Kahim. The bottom of the invitation says dress in formal clothing, in holiday dark clothing. So that was put on the bottom. And in fact, of the 37 signers of the Declaration of Independence, 34 of them wore ties, of the men. The men wore ties. Even the head of the Communist Party wore a tie. The only three who did not were members of the kibbutz movement. So what's going on here if Ben Gurion was a socialist? Now, it's important to note from a stylistic, why didn't socialists wear ties? So some of them didn't wear ties because the ties, the suits, were associated with the bourgeoisie, the rich people, the wealthy people. That was very bourgeoisie. They wore ties. So of course, by definition, we're not going to wear ties to differentiate. Also, Joseph Stalin, who still many of the Jews were fans of in the 1940s and even 1948 from the war, didn't realize exactly how much of an anti-Semite he was at that point. Looked up to Joseph Stalin. Stalin, never wore a tie. So you had this whole thing from the socialist idea that they wouldn't wear ties. That was dress of the bourgeoisie. Then you also have the idea that the Jewish community that was building the state of Israel, then called Palestine, wanted to differentiate, disassociate themselves from anything that was considered the old home. So therefore, if in the old home Jews wore ties and more professionally, whether they were religious Jews from Eastern Europe or the more westernized Jews from Western Europe, they wanted to differentiate themselves from that. So they wore the more local, the informal clothing. And lastly, the weather in state of Palestine was much warmer, Middle Eastern weather. So therefore, their tendency of any which way of dressing more informally and lighter played a role. So you have these factors coming around, and yet there we see Ben Gurion wearing a suit. So it's interesting. So Ben Gurion, especially as he matured into a leader, realized that he was going to be a leader on the world stage. And as a leader of the world stage, he had to interact with other international leaders, and therefore he had to play that game. He had to play that game, and he realized that therefore he would have to, on those occasions, which required him to interact with leaders, or when he's declaring the state of Israel, the real targeted audience of his declaration is the world stage or the world leaders. So therefore he dresses the role. So Ben Gurion already understood there was David Ben Gurion, the individual. There was David Ben Gurion in terms of his own life. There was David Ben Gurion, who might have been the leader of the Yishuv, of the Jewish community in Palestine. But then there's David Ben Gurion, who wants to be an international leader. And as an international leader, he has to wear that suit. He has to wear the tie and make that statement. So there explains a little bit why Ben Gurion wore the tie. Now, interesting to take this to a different level, Ben Gurion also, and he had many faults. In the leadership studies, he had many strengths and he had many, many faults, but he did understand the importance of keeping his eye on the big prize, which was getting a state. So therefore, he was willing to compromise on certain things not to get derailed. So for example, the British mandate was really ending the next day, May 15th. So why does he declare the state on May 14th? Hey, it was supposed to be the next day. But the declaration of the state is 4 o'clock Friday afternoon, because Ben Gurion didn't want to start the state on Shabbat. He needed the Orthodox representatives, people like Rav Maimon and others, to be involved, to be on board. And he didn't want, he had enough issues to be dealing with. He didn't want to have internal strife right at the beginning of that there should be no, that should be, the state should start B'chilul Shabbat. Therefore, he moves it up. He declares the state before the British mandate. And what I think is one of the, to show that the Jewish leadership at the time had a sense of humor. I mean, you can get this online. On the invitation, it says to the people, Lishmor Basod, please keep this secret. Okay, this is arguably one of the worst kept secrets in Jewish history. Everybody in Tel Aviv showed up, or many of them, they knew about this, but it's funny that they even put on, keep the secret. They were afraid the British might try to interdict it, to stop it. So he makes it so he doesn't want to be Mechalel Shabbat. Another interesting thing, in the morning, there's still, we look at this thing, you can read the Israeli Declaration of Independence, it's hanging in many yeshivot, and yet the people, when you see them signing it, they're signing a blank page. They have this rolled out thing, they're holding it down like there's writing there. There's nothing on that document. They didn't have enough time to actually write it on the parchment, because they were still editing it the last day. In the morning of Friday morning, there was a machloket, there was a vikuach, there was a debate, should God's name be mentioned in it or not? You have the representatives of the religious community claiming, let's mention God's name, and you have the representatives of the communist socialist community saying, there is no God. So back and forth, and Ben Gurion is in a lose-lose situation. He puts God's name in it, he's got the leftists who are very upset, and they may get, they may pull out. If he doesn't put God's name, and he's got the Orthodox. So he's caught in a bit of a bind. So they agree with this ambiguous term called Tzur Yisrael, the Rock of Israel, which allows the Orthodox to interpret it as a reference to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to God. And it allows the communists and the socialists and the atheists to interpret it as the strength of Israel, our internal strength. So that's a compromise in the morning already of Tzur Yisrael, to be able to avoid another thing. Because again, Ben Gurion wanted the state to be declared. He didn't want it derailed. He believed very firmly, if not now, this isn't going to happen in the near future. So that's another compromise. Another big debate, if you read if you read the declaration carefully, there is no mention of borders. Now, the legalists who are on the team, you had, and of course, Jews are lawyers, so you had many lawyers who were involved in the crafting of the Declaration of Independence, insisted we've got to put the borders in, namely the borders that were approved on November 29th, 1947 by the UN Resolution 181. Ben Gurion pushes, and he says, no, we're not putting the borders in, because he was hoping that as a course of the war, in fact, what does happen, that Israel would expand its borders beyond, he knew the Arabs were going to attack, and then we would expand the borders beyond what was in the United Nations partition plan. But if we would put the borders inside the Declaration of Independence, we'd be stuck retroactively having to go back to that. So it was a big fight, but Ben Gurion wins that fight. And in fact, inside the Declaration of Independence, in the text, there is no reference to borders, which was another interesting debate that occurred at the time. Now, interestingly, we get to an interesting debate. Those of you who are old enough to remember the movie Cast a Giant Shadow with Kirk Douglas about the Mickey Marcus story, which is one of the filmed scenes of the Declaration of Independence, notice when Ben Gurion declares the state of Israel, immediately they get a telegram that the United States recognizes the state of Israel. In fact, it was de facto, not de jure recognition. And it seems that it's right away. It seems that America recognizes the state of Israel, the first one to do so, which is true, right away. If you look at the literature out there, it says that the United States recognized the new state of Israel 11 minutes after it was declared. Okay, sounds very simple, except if you read Ben Gurion's military biography. He kept a biography a diary for a little bit over a year during the 1948 war. Now, just an interesting side story, I was developing a course that I teach in college on the 1948 war, and this was a very, very important source that I needed. I tried searching it for on the internet in the States, and I found one version that they wanted $1,000 for it. That was a bit above my price range. When I got to Israel in the summer, though, I did some research. I found a used bookstore on off of King George Street, and the guy sold me the 3-volume set for $30. So I bought it, a little bit better than the $1,000, and it's a wealth of information. So here, looking in the diary, we've got a problem, because on the day of May 15th, Ben Gurion writes, "He'ira oti pa'amayim halayla." They woke me up twice that night. Ba'achat lohodia li sheTruman maker b'medina hayehudit. One time was to tell me that Truman recognized the state of Israel. Whoa, that's a problem. I don't think that he went to sleep at 4:15 in the afternoon, and that 11 minutes later, Truman was calling. This sounds like in the middle of the night. And yet, all the documents seem to say that Truman recognizes 11 minutes after. So this was really bothering me because I have a contradiction from the diary to what we know. So I actually did some detective work and was researching this and found out the answer of a former Israeli ambassador who wrote an article while visiting the Truman Library. So in fact, this is a copy, I know you can't see it too clearly, of Truman's letter of recognition. And it says on the bottom, approved May 14th, 1948. And then right over here, if you can see, let's see if I can get it. It's reversed, but it says 6/11. 6/11 is when it says to make this announcement. So what happened was that at the time, the difference in time between Israel and America was 6 hours, not 7 hours like now. It was a 6-hour time difference. The British mandate actually ended at midnight, May 14th. Remember, the mandate was ending May 15th. Ben Gurion moves it up to avoid Chilul Shabbat. So the actual mandate is ending 12 o'clock a.m., May 15th, Israel time, which is 6 hours ahead of Washington time, which is 6 p.m. Washington time. So what happens is as follows, that Truman did want to recognize it the first, but not when Ben Gurion declares it, but when legally, in terms of international law, when the mandate ends, that's when he wanted to recognize it. So 12 a.m. Israel time was 6 p.m. Washington time, which is when the mandate ended, and therefore it's 6/11 Washington time, 12:11 a.m. Israel time, when the recognition of the United States actually takes hold. So in fact, everything's true. The only thing not true is the movie. But in fact, anything you read that's 11 minutes afterwards is true. And even Ben Gurion, when he said, I was woken up in the middle of the night, is true as well, because it was 12:11 in the morning. So that explains the content. The only thing that's not true is the movie that shows it happening right away, but we'll forgive them. That was Hollywood in the mid 1960s. So that was a little detective work to see when exactly it was recognized. Now, a few more interesting things. So it was the playing of the Hatikva. Now, if you've ever been to Ulam Haasmaut in Tel Aviv, there's a balcony there. And the Israel, I don't know what it was called at the time, was it with the Tel Aviv Philharmonic, the Israeli Palestine Philharmonic, I'm not sure of its name, but the Philharmonic Orchestra was summoned, and they were put on the upper balcony and was blocked by a curtain to play Hatikva. Now, the original plan was that when Ben-Gurion got there, and the entire ceremony takes less than half an hour, they were supposed to start with Hatikva and then end with Hatikva as well. But the orchestra was blocked by a curtain of some sort, so they couldn't see what was going on downstairs. How was it supposed to be? There was supposed to be a kid, a teenager of some sort, 12-year-old, 13-year-old, who when Ben-Gurion got up at the podium to speak, he was supposed to press a button, a green light would go on the balcony, and that would be the signal for the orchestra to play Hatikva. What happened? There were so many people rushing into the Ulama Atzmot, it was the Dizengoff's house, the Tel Aviv Museum, that the kid who was supposed to press that button got shoved into the bathroom, and the door got locked. He couldn't get the door open at the beginning, so he couldn't press the button. The green light didn't go on. The orchestra didn't play, and Ben-Gurion standing there looking, okay, what's going on? Because he knew, according to the Tochnit, according to the plan, the orchestra was supposed to play the Hatikva. They don't play, and Ben-Gurion starts speaking in his speech without the Hatikva because the kid couldn't press the button. That was one piece of interesting information regarding that. Now, there's a separate debate that, this Wednesday we're celebrating Yom HaAtzmaut, saying Hallel and celebrating. So there's a big discussion amongst the rabbis and the Israeli government. When should we really celebrate? Should we celebrate the day of the declaration? But after all, the war begins right then. So then others said that maybe the celebration should have been at the time when the war ended, which would have been March or so, 1949. And others said maybe we should have waited till the armistice was signed, which was July or so of 1949. Why Dafka? It's far from a davar muvan me'elav that it should be done at this time. So people discuss many different things. Everyone has their opinion why it should be now, and in terms of the miracle, this, that, the other thing. But I found an interesting thing referred somewhere, and I found it online afterwards. The first chief rabbi of Israel, the first Sephardic Ashkenazic chief rabbi of Israel, Avram Yitzchak Cohen Cook, his son, Rav Tzvi Yehuda Cook, who's the philosophical leader of the Gush Emunim movement, the whole settlements in the Yudav the Shomron, had a very, very interesting insight. When we say Hallel and when we celebrate the biggest miracle. And what's the biggest miracle in life? What is the biggest miracle? Is it that we won the war? So if you look at the Gemara, the Gemaras generally say that the biggest miracles are when we go against human nature, because that's the hardest thing to do. When we went, a number of years ago, I see some people online who were with us. I was privileged to go with Rabbi Besser in the summer to visit wounded soldiers during one of the wars in Gaza. And we visited an Iron Dome base. And at the time, there were different stories flying around, no pun intended, that the miracles of the Iron Dome, and that the missile was flying in, and at the last second, the wind came and blew Iron Dome missile, this, that, the other thing, and saved the day. So I remember when I got back, and then after we had interviewed some of the kids in the army there at the Iron Dome, someone asked me, what do I think was the biggest miracle? I said, look, I don't know if that story is true or not, but I'll tell you what the biggest miracle is. That we interviewed these 19-year-old kids who had to make life and death decisions in a matter of seconds, whether or not to launch an Iron Dome missile. And I said, working with teenagers, walking on Avenue J, you know, teenagers aren't exactly great at making decisions. Go into any restaurant, stand behind some kids who are trying to order a salad or food, you could be there for minutes. Decision making is not their strength. And here suddenly we see a bunch of 19-year-olds who are able to make these life and death decisions in a matter of seconds. I said, to me, that was the biggest miracle that I witnessed, that they were able to go against their human nature. So if Tzvi Yehuda Kook writes, what was the biggest miracle? If you read the literature, the history, the historiography, Ben Gurion had so much pressure going against him not to recognize. He wasn't sure Truman was going to acknowledge because Truman was fighting in his own State Department. He was, and the rest of the world was pretty much against him too. The amount of strength and courage that Ben Gurion and his group were able to muster to declare the state nonetheless against this unimaginable pressure, Rav Tzvi Yehuda Kook writes, that's the biggest miracle. They went against human nature to make a decision like that. Okay? So that is why Yom HaAtzmaut, in that sense, is the biggest miracle. It's even a bigger miracle than the military victories on the battlefield, because at the end of the day, the military victories can be explained strategically and tactically and things along those lines. But that idea of being able to go against human nature and make a life, literally a life or death decision like that, required superhuman, miraculous ability. And that's why Rav Tzvi Yehuda Kook writes, we celebrate Hey ER, Yom HaAtzmaut, because that was the biggest miracle. As the Gemara tells us in multiple places, going against human nature is really the biggest miracle. I'll just conclude with one of my favorite stories about the Declaration of Independence, that if you watch the movie again, Mickey Marcus, the Cast a Giant Shadow about Mickey Marcus, when they have the scene, and you can catch it online, it's on YouTube, that minute, those 2 minutes, they have a very, very emotional Hatikva at the end, which is true. They sang, the orchestra did play Hatikva at the end of the ceremony, and it was supposedly an Od Miragesh. It was an extremely emotional Hatikva, and the movie catches it somewhat. But the funny thing is there's no actual footage of the actual singing of Hatikva. It was being filmed. We have the video. We have the video of Ben Gurion declaring the state. There were some issues that happened with some of the original film. That's a story in and of itself. But there is no video of the singing of the Hatikva. What happened to it? So years later, I mean, it wasn't, back in the day, they didn't all have cell phones. Today we'd have 300 people there. We'd have 300 plus, it'd be uploaded right away on Instagram. At the time, they didn't have that. They had one guy who was filming it the old-fashioned way. Years later, they interviewed the photographer and they asked him the question, what happened to, why isn't there any video of the Hatikva at the end? And the photographer said, Ani basav adam, I'm a human being. I myself got so caught up in the emotion of the moment, having a state after 2,000 years, when everyone started to sing Hatikva, I started to sing Hatikva with them, and I stopped filming. And that's why there's no film of it, according to the photographer. So, as we celebrate this week at Yom HaAtzmaut, may we thank HaKadosh Baruch Hu for the wonderful things that Israel has given us, and that He has given us through Israel, and that as we continue to pray that He should send Yeshua and Refuah to everyone who needs one, to Am Yisrael, and to protect our soldiers and to protect the state of Israel, and that the state of Israel should continue to develop and prosper, and that each year the celebration can be more and more and greater. And this year too, when we sing Hatikva, that we also capture that emotion. And I would recommend not say it somewhat as a tefillah as well during this time period. Chag Sameach in advance, and thank you very much for joining today. Have a wonderful day.